Welcome to the lecture Game Design and Game Development. In this lecture, we want to talk about some fundamentals of project management. To make it easier to find the relevant information later, we see the list of content here. Project management is, per definition, the management of projects. In general, project management refers to the structured procedure for mastering complex tasks. When we work as employees in a company, everyday things that have to be done there are actually tasks. If we look at these tasks, there are tasks that differ from others by their characteristics. For example, one can state that a project is also a task, but not every task is also a project. So the question is, at what point do we call a task a project? It has been agreed to handle it in such a way that a project is a complex task that cannot be completed easily by working through existing routines, structures, methods, or processes. We may need novel solutions, but it can also be that a new team comes together to solve a task. Then, too, we can speak of a project. We should now ask ourselves the question, at what point or in which cases do we need project management? For this purpose, we have a small checklist here. The more positive responses there are, the higher the need for project management. Press pause, take some time and read through this list once at your own leisure. Take your time to read in carefully. During this lecture, a series of questions will be asked. You must be able to answer these questions for your project at the end. So in this case, does your project need project management? A project naturally also needs a person in charge, the so-called project manager. We can take a look at what qualities are required for a project manager in terms of management qualities and employee leadership. In terms of management qualifications, he or she should of course be fit to plan, think economically, act confidently, and have the ability to assert himself or herself. On the other hand, when it comes to leading employees, he is expected to be able to assess people correctly, to entrust them with the right tasks, to encourage them, to motivate them, to promote creativity, and to possess a high level of self-motivation which he can also transfer to others. It is important here not to think in competitive patterns, and the projects must of course also be presented to superiors with confidence. The topic of employee management can also be very decisive for the success of a project. If we place the project manager in the middle, we see the hard-working project staff on the left. You will surely recognize yourselves here. The project manager also has the task to motivate the team and to keep them happy. On the other hand, the project manager also has to present the project convincingly to the superior or the sponsor. If we take a look at the job advertisements for project managers, we see that technical and methodological skills are required. You have to have analytical skills, be problem and goal-oriented, action-oriented. You have to be willing to learn. You have to be able to inspire. You have to be able to deal with conflict, and especially the ability to work in a team is extremely important here. Each of you can now ask yourself the question, am I actually suitable to be a project manager? You could see your studies, in which you are involved in many projects, as a good opportunity to gain experience and to take on the role of a project manager yourself. This gives everyone the chance to further their education in the position, and if not here in the study program, then when? You could now go through this checklist and see how you assess your abilities. This gives you the opportunity to work on points that are marked with no or only partially, and to develop yourself further in this way. Here we see the second part of the checklist. Very important here. Are they capable of self-criticism, or can you learn from mistakes? And this raises another important question for you. Who is actually the project manager at your project? In addition to the project manager, the controlling committee is also a very important element in project management. It may be necessary to give regular updates on the progress of the project and the state of development. The project manager can also relieve himself and have certain decisions approved. Therefore, it is urgent to clarify to whom which information is to be delivered and when. The question also arises, what influence does the controlling committee have? Who is on my side here, or whom do I possibly still have to convince? When do which work results have to be coordinated with whom? When does management have to be informed about deviations? Imagine you decide to take a certain Unity version for the project development. This is called a software freeze. During a development phase, hopefully no one will get the idea to change tools during development. This can cause extreme conflicts. Here is an obligatory question. Is there a controlling committee for your project? It is like so often in life. When projects fail, the reasons are usually not to be found in difficulties with content, but rather in crises at the personal relationship level. It is precisely here that the skills of a project manager are required, which can be described as soft skills. This brings us to the topic of authority. At the beginning of the project, it should also be clear to every project participant what authorizations the project manager has. There could be decision-making or directive powers, or disciplinary powers. There could be a right of claim against other departments or projects. For example, the lecturer has promised to provide a certain censor. Of course, since we are doing this in a special student atmosphere, I hope that everyone will support and cooperate with the project leader. It is clear that a project manager needs time to organize some things. We see, for example, that in the first project phase about 30% is needed for project planning and monitoring. Then the team has to be set up and coordinated. The departments have to be brought together. Coordination and communication with superiors must be planned. There are administrative tasks that need to be completed. After the project has been initiated, it is generally estimated that only about 20% of the time is spent planning and monitoring the project. We can already see that a project manager can contribute only little to real development. Here we see again the different task packages for a project manager listed. There are of course preparatory tasks such as project initialization. The project planning must be accomplished. A project management is required. For this, it is of course necessary to know about all sub-project statuses, challenges, upcoming tasks, etc. Maybe the project plan has to be revised here. This is where project planning and control directly overlap. Quality control is also an important aspect. Have the goals set in the project been achieved? Are they still achievable? Or are there challenges that need to be addressed? Project completion must also be planned. Just like the obligatory kick-off meeting, there should be a project closure. The team has been developing together for some time and will continue to do so in the future, so it is appropriate to celebrate this in a befitting manner. I would also like to recommend the following to you. I always say at the beginning of a project, a book for every lead. This means that everyone who takes responsibility in the project in any way needs something tactile, perhaps a small notebook in which all previous decisions and deadlines have been entered. This is also done in larger companies. This means that if the person in charge is absent due to illness, for example, the book is kept in the company and the substitute can see exactly what tasks are pending, what was discussed last in the meeting, and continue the project at that point. But it also gives security because arguments can be quickly brought out again to confirm decisions from the past. For example, in the discussion it could be said, "We had already agreed 4 weeks ago that," etc. Although the digital world exists and supports us very well, you might want to try it with a small notebook. I already mentioned earlier who should actually fill such a project manager position. We can discuss various solution models and their advantages and disadvantages in general. As always, there is no patent solution for the correct filling of a project manager position. I have summarized 3 classic examples of how to fill a position and briefly listed their advantages and disadvantages. If, for example, you appoint the most competent person as project manager, or someone who is particularly strong in leadership, or even an external person would be thinkable here. If we take the most competent person, we have someone who is really interested in the project, who is always available, who brings a lot of technical and methodological competence. Of course, this also brings disadvantages. We have seen that a project manager has to invest a lot of time in management tasks. This leaves less time for co-development in the project. Then there are often problems with competitive thinking, because who should contradict the most competent person in the project? Thus, creativity and alternative solutions are unfortunately often prevented. If we look at the person with the most leadership skills, he or she may be neutral towards the project, have a strategic view, be sensitive to resources, but may not be team-oriented enough. This again creates problems in stimulating creativity because the person may not be able to assess whether the solutions are good or bad and may put more emphasis on his leadership position. If we bring in an external person as project manager, he or she brings experience and is also neutral towards the project. However, he or she also has little identification with the project, must first create trust, and may no longer be available after the project. Here I have a few more tips and hints for the aspiring project manager. You can read up on project management, but here, as always in life, nothing beats experience. So just try it out. Then take a look over the shoulders of others. How do your colleagues do good project management? Learn from the good and the not so good things and draw your conclusions. Exchange tips and experiences. It is also important for a project manager never to let something be imposed on him that seems too big, or if there are other important reasons against it. You also have to be clear whether you have a good idea of the project's framework conditions. This should be done as early as possible. Were there any differences in advance? Was the project started against the will of the project staff, or is the project just a political decision? In project management, there is the so-called magic triangle. In this triangle, the three goals that are pursued in the project are once again linked with each other. On the one hand, there are the costs we have to keep to a certain budget. There are times by which certain project parts or the entire project must be completed. And then there are the quality requirements or the results that we are pursuing with the project. If we now consider the area of the triangle as constant, then it is clear that if we pull on one of the corners, that has immediate effects on the other corners. So if we want to finish the project faster, we have to invest more money or lower the quality. For us, this also means that project planning must always link the project process with scheduling and resource planning. In other words, all three components must be visible in the planning. Furthermore, we need appropriately interlocked management and control mechanisms for project planning. First, let's start with the goals. A project task in its overall context is often clear. The situation is often different when it comes to the sub-goals. These are vague and not concretely formulated or broken down. But we need these sub-goals for further planning and also for the communication of the team and with the stakeholders. Now there are three categories of goals that may help us a little bit. There are objective goals, so there are certain requirements or functions that a project has to fulfill in the end. You have to ask yourself how this is to be organized in terms of time, what dependencies there are between each other. Then there may be some framework conditions that need to be taken into account, such as legal regulations or environmental protection issues. For the three target categories just mentioned, there are also typical questions that can help you here. For example, in the case of the objective goals, what should the product be used for, or who should use the product, etc. Here, these questions can provide a good orientation. Now it is time to formulate goals well. There should also be a few tips for this. Goals must always be defined completely. It is always good to describe them very concisely, but goals must also be measurable. For example, this functionality is used by 80% of users or something like that, or it must deliver a solution at this or any speed. Goals are also measurable to be able to check the quality afterwards. Goals should also not contradict each other. Goals should be ambitious, but must be realistic and achievable. And what many forget, there must also be a time budget or a time for the achievement of a goal. To summarize the whole thing compactly, there is the mnemonic SMART. Are the stated goal definitions specific, measurable, ambitious, realistic, and timed? Then, of course, the defined goals have to be coordinated. For this purpose, the so-called list of objectives or list of goals is drawn up. This is also the basis that we later have to discuss with the supervisor. The kickoff meeting is also a wonderful opportunity to present the target definitions to the entire team once again. In larger projects with industry partners, the goals are recorded in the so-called specification sheet. This is the agreement between the client and the contractor. So here again, a very important task for you. Is there already a catalog of goals? I have already mentioned that it is always important in a project to correctly assess all the people involved, and especially in the preparation of a project, the power of the people involved. So we ask ourselves the questions: do you actually know who is involved in front of and behind your project? Do you correctly assess the power of all those involved? To answer these questions, we use the so-called stakeholder analysis. The term stakeholder is often misleading. We state here, whoever is directly or indirectly involved with your project belongs to the group stakeholder. To do this, of course, we first have to identify all persons and groups of persons. You can basically consider the client, the controlling committee, the customers, and all your team members as stakeholders. Do not forget the target group for whom the project result is desired. Not all stakeholders are equally important, and few are problematic. We should now work out stakeholder roles and relevance by asking key questions. Who determines the general conditions? On whom does success depend? Who is affected by the result? For whom might the project have a particular benefit? Who do you need to involve with special measures? Who must be informed regularly? Whom do you have to convince? Who can harm the project by being negative? Who promotes the project? Where can you personally hope for support? Don't forget, influence can also be exerted in hidden ways. We see here two examples of a stakeholder analysis. This could be done in tabular form. We see different stakeholders listed that have been identified. We think about what attitudes each stakeholder has towards the project. We always assume that the target group is very skeptical and needs special convincing and attention. We can also consider what influence the stakeholders have and then derive the actions from that. In this example, we see that we want to ensure acceptance among the target group. Or let's look at the second example below. The project manager knows how vain the marketing manager is, so he decides to elegantly involve the colleague. As an expert, he is to give his opinion on certain problems. This gives him a meaningful role in the project, which hopefully has a positive impact on his attitude. I would like to summarize here once again 4 reasons why this stakeholder analysis can benefit us. Stakeholder analysis saves you a lot of time and nerves, not only because you can target communication with those affected right from the start. Especially in the phase of project implementation, it is relieving if you no longer have to conduct fundamental discussions. You must see yourself as a project marketer who has to represent his project internally and externally and create acceptance for it. You may already have encountered open resistance or reservations about the project. The sooner you eliminate reservations, the fewer conflicts you risk. If there are problems, you can use backing from higher up. For this, you need a person with influence who is sympathetic to your project. Checking with them before you start the project to see when and how you can approach them will help you sleep better. So we ask ourselves again, which stakeholders does the project have? Next, we need to ask ourselves how we want to organize the project, because everyone wants to complete their tasks as effectively as possible. To do this, we also need to know who is authorized to do what and who is responsible for what. We also need to find the right balance in the team for your use of digital tools. Task areas and competences should be created in the project so there is room for maneuver for management and control. For example, there is one person who takes care of AI topics, another takes care of a basic visual concept. These are then the leads of a project, and the project manager can then exchange ideas with them and thus work faster and more effectively due to the short communication distances. The rule here is you should not underestimate organizational issues. Here too, perhaps a few small hints. Try to ensure continuity for yourself and project participants. For example, if we change communication tools or project rules every 2 weeks, it's difficult to adjust, and that doesn't exactly stimulate team enthusiasm. Next is, explore in good time what other tasks the company can offer you after the project and actively seek a new project. For example, if you are in the process of writing your thesis, you should already be thinking about how you can continue afterwards without any major gaps in time. Then a well-coordinated team that knows and can assess each other can also be a major trump card. Let's take another brief look at the higher level instances. We have already met the controlling committee, which also supports the project manager. bears responsibility and controls the results at the end. The technical committee supports with technical things, with knowledge, for example. Then we have the topic of multi-project management. In multi-project management, for example, the most useful projects are selected and prioritized, or an overarching risk management system is installed. Ongoing projects are accompanied by comprehensive controlling. Quality and process standards are also frequently controlled by multi-project management. Here we see once again a checklist of organizational needs. The larger the project, the greater the need for organizational methods and tools. Read through the questions at your own leisure. Here is another important question for you. What is the organization for your project? The following topic is perhaps not so relevant for us now, but it is important to mention in this context. Should we ever put together a team and assign roles, we should clarify in advance who we are looking for the employee position or what criteria the person must fulfill in order to fill a certain role in the project. Once again, an important sentence should be noted here. Projects fail not because of technology, but because of people. In order that the communication and the creation of the versatile documentation works smoothly, I would like to give a few important hints here again. It is not only the team members who are informed about important events and the project status. Other stakeholders also need to be provided with selected information on a regular basis. 4 important points we should always remember are: first, determine who needs to be actively informed about what and when. It's called push principle. Use the stakeholder analysis for this purpose. Second, determine as far as possible in which cases the participants or team members have to obtain certain information themselves. It's called pull principle. Regulate all access options. Whoever is looking for information should be able to find it without barriers. Third, arrange for someone to be responsible for project documentation and set the conditions for this. And fourth, for the exchange of information during the implementation of the project, you need to define the so-called reporting system. Once again, I have a checklist for you. The questions will help you to think of the important points of reporting. Here we see once again what needs to be done, for example, which reports need to be created and for whom. Work through these questions thoroughly for your project. Again, a question for you. Is there a reporting system and how does it look like? Let's move on to the start of the project. The catalog of objectives, a rough plan, the reporting system are ready. Now we want to summarize this in a so-called project order. In principle, these are also the elements that will be presented later in a kickoff meeting. We see the most important contents listed here. Still open points are provided with deadlines, for example, this will be submitted on, etc. Question for you. Is there a project order? Then finally comes the start of the project, and this is usually celebrated. I think it is very important that we start this with a kickoff meeting. If it can be arranged, the client, all team members and other stakeholders are invited. The project manager then introduces the content, goals, team members, and their roles in the project. Below you can see 3 examples of a kickoff meeting here in another lecture called 3D Programming. Question for you, when is the kickoff meeting? We once again note, good planning is half the battle. Planning gives the original idea a structure, divides the project into manageable units. Deviations from deadlines and undesirable developments can thus be recognized earlier and counteracted more quickly. Remember that you have to react flexibly in the project. Planning must therefore be kept up to date during the course of the project. Keep your planning transparent. No matter when decisions are made, always check who is affected by the planning and must be informed about what and to which scope. Who do you need to coordinate with about planning? If ongoing project changes are necessary, with whom are they to be coordinated, etc. The project manager usually passes the result of the planning to the decision-making instance in the form of a report in which all planning documents are summarized. Again, I want to give an analogy for perspective that we should never forget. For you as a project manager, the project is like a small child that you see every day. You will hardly be surprised by the progress it makes. The aunt, who comes to visit twice a year is quite different. If we have a project idea and have created an initial project plan, it will certainly be the case that this can never be worked through 100%. It is also often not possible to break everything down to the smallest detail. This is also always the case when it is a project with a high creative content. At the beginning, we don't know whether the idea will work, for example, whether it will resonate with the target group. We will see that in another lecture and learn tools and methods for dealing with it. Now let's create a two-step plan. We'll start with a work breakdown structure, looking at the project as a whole, and then we'll get into the phase plans that come out of that. When we make such a plan, central elements are the work packages and activities, times, capacities, and costs. We have just talked about project phases, and very typical in this context is the term milestone. These milestones describe the completion of a phase, so to speak. By definition, you can say that a milestone represents a self-contained partial result, and then time for evaluation is typically taken. In industry, a milestone can lead to a decision whether missing content will be reworked, the project can be continued or even stopped. Milestones are very useful and give us a basis for decision-making, control and monitoring dates, and thus provide the framework for project development. Only when the phase product has passed the review, the next phase is approved. Milestones are therefore a good way of clearly defining the progress of a project. However, one must always be clear about what such a milestone means, because it can also lead to the project being aborted. The more complex a project is, the more phases, the more milestones there will be. It is important that these milestones are named, that manageable and feasible tasks are defined, and that a work result is described. In project management, there are a number of phase models with linear, parallel, or iterative progressions, which I will not go into in detail here. However, the iterative phase model is usually the best choice for our task. Here we have an adaptive, prototypical approach and try to get answers from the target group via tests, which in turn directly influence the further course of the project. More about this in another lecture. The division into project phases has some advantages, of course. Phases create decision points for initially unmanageable tasks. You can proceed more systematically, identify the problems at hand more quickly, think about possible solutions, and implement the best solution. In top-down approaches, that asks are divided and then completed. The partial solutions are integrated again with regard to the project goal. Furthermore, we can say that control is made easier, and planning according to project phases minimizes risks. Now we are going to look at a few examples of such a milestone plan. We could indicate the milestones in a classical linear way, for example in a table. There we have the columns with the phase result, the planned date of completion, the real date of completion, and a column for reasons for the planning change. The milestones are now arranged chronologically and numbered consecutively. We can see in this example that two major test phases are scheduled until the finished product is at the end. Let's take a look at some milestones in the Ignotus project. Here, especially at the beginning, the most important point was to define a concrete plan for the gameplay. The players were to navigate through a game world with a canoe to which a sensor was attached. The primary goal here was to achieve playability and overcome this technical hurdle. Detailed game content was then brought in at later stages. Let's take a look at two videos showing different prototypes. Project management now offers many small tools that you can use for your project work. For example, the milestone trend analysis. We have seen that milestones are highly interdependent. Some can be managed in parallel, others not. Some run better in terms of time and others worse. In the trend analysis, we see these interdependencies and can react to upcoming delays. For example, we can parallelize things or add new employees to the project. To get a good overview of the upcoming tasks, the creation of a work breakdown structure is a useful thing. This can also be done well in a team. At the top of this plan comes the main task, and below it, the already identified subtasks. Tasks that cannot be divided because they belong together and are the responsibility of the same person are referred to as so-called work packages. The first draft should then be reviewed again and then finalized. We have now reached the lowest level of the project structure plan with the work packages. Now we need to discuss how to describe these work packages. For each work package, the following elements are required: objective or outcome, content and scope, the responsible party and employees involved in the work package, effort, duration, time frame for completion, start and end date. Additionally, we can also include the predecessor and successor work package. There are now various tools available to us that allow us to arrange the work packages in a timeline. This results in an initial rough schedule for the project. Below are two websites that are very useful for this context. The first one is in German and the second one is in English. Here we can take a look at the milestone plan for the project Escape the Cave as it was initially established. It was certainly sensible to include a buffer at the end of the project. Here is the final slide of the project presentation for the Escape the Cave project. The students have presented their perspective on the project's progress in an interesting manner at the top, and finally, they have compiled points that they consider to be very important. First, Agile project makes sense. Second, you need a healthy balance of action and reaction. Third, have courage for changes. Fourth, communication and coordination are always important. Fifth, always remain time critical. And sixth, don't forget to include to plan a buffer in your project. We have now reached the end of this lecture. Throughout the lecture, I have asked you some questions and tried to motivate you by providing examples. At the same time, I have given you tasks to work on, which you need to take care of now. To ensure that you don't forget any of these important tasks, I have listed them all chronologically once again. After listening carefully to this lecture, answering the following comprehension question should help you to summarize the most important statements again on your own.